E ka mana, e ka reo, e ka mauka whakahi, e ka wawa, e ka pātaka o ka tauka tuku iho. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. For those who don't know me, my name's David Murdoch. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University, and it's a great pleasure to be here today to celebrate the promotion to Professor of Simon Stebbings. As some of you will be aware, or many of you will be aware, we've had, with our program of inaugural professorial lectures, we've had quite a lot of disruption over the past year or two. And the good news is that we're busy catching up at the moment, and it's been wonderful to be part of these events. In fact, we had 4 last week, would you believe, and that's we've been running about 2 to 4 for most weeks recently. And for an absolute highlight of my role is to be able to go around and hear what's happening around our incredible institution from some amazing people, and continues tonight. So one of my main role is to welcome everybody and welcome everyone who's come here in person, but we also have people who will be watching online, either live or delayed, and that's been huge, I think, to be able to access these events online at the moment. So welcome everybody, welcome everyone from university community, the city and beyond. But I do want to give some special welcome to Simon's whānau and friends, and I understand here tonight, I have met son Leo, so welcome, but I understand Simon's partner Rebecca is here tonight, Rebecca, and John Heighton, I think, is a key mentor. John, nice to see you again, but also a few people watching online. I gather because of the time zone, a few of them may be watching it delayed, but that's to Simon's parents, brother, sister, maybe others who are online. So big welcome to everyone. It's wonderful to have you here. Now I'm going to hand over shortly to Joe Baxter, who will give a more detailed introduction to Simon and his career. But I just want to make a point at this stage just to comment, as Simon is a clinical academic, clinical researcher, and certainly looking at his CV as someone who's highly productive, and I must say it's characteristic of so many of our clinical researchers that to combine very busy clinical roles with very active and very productive research careers, and certainly Simon appears to have had that for sure. And I just also acknowledge his interest as a rheumatologist into some pretty complex and chronic conditions, and that brings many challenges, and so really just to acknowledge that before passing over to Joe. But big congratulations, Simon, on your promotion. Very much looking forward to your lecture, and I will hand over to Joe. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
E ngā mana, e ngā waka, e ngā reo, e ngā rauranga tira mā, tēnā koutou, kia ora no tātou katoa. Kei te tūau, kei te mihi ki a koutou, ngā iwi ngoa, ngā haue wha, nau mai, haere mai. Well, kia ora, and a huge mihi and greetings to you all, and it is indeed a privilege for me to stand up here and have the opportunity to introduce Professor Simon Stebbings in his inaugural professorial lecture. So as David Murdoch has said, I'm Joe Baxter. I'm the new Dean of the Dunedin School of Medicine, and one of the privileges that one gets in becoming a Dean is the opportunity to acknowledge and celebrate the achievements of our key staff in the school, and so it is an intense privilege and honour to have this opportunity today. And before introducing Simon, I really do want to acknowledge again what David has already mentioned, which is the contribution that our clinical researchers and clinical academics make. And I know that not only are you making a difference out there working with individuals, whānau communities, supporting the health and healthcare needs of many people, but you're also engaging with teaching and learning for our next generation of doctors, and also very much contributing in terms of research. And in particular over this time of COVID, I know that all of those things have had an increased level of pressure, and so I do want to thank you and acknowledge you for the wider work that you do. So in terms of Simon, and we had a lovely meeting to talk about this, and I don't want to steal his thunder because his presentation is about his journey, but in terms of introduction, Simon is a rheumatologist and head of the Rheumatology Research Unit in the Department of Medicine in the Dunedin School of Medicine. His research is focused on spondyloarthritis, which is a common inflammatory arthritis of the spine. Simon has studied the genetic basis of this condition through international collaborations, which have led to new tools for early diagnosis. He's also extensively researched the role that the immune system and gut bacteria play in the development and perpetuation of spondyloarthritis. He has been the New Zealand representative on a board developing guidelines for managing spondyloarthritis across the Asia-Pacific region, and his other research focus is through a long-standing collaboration with the psychology department, investigating the impact of fatigue and most recently the effects of COVID-19 pandemic on people with arthritis. So today's talk has an intriguing title, which I won't talk more about because I know that Simon may be likely to explain about it, but he will take us on his journey in medicine, rheumatology and research. And he will talk about his research and about the contribution he's made alongside colleagues to understanding the genetic and environmental factors that lead to the development of the condition. I really look forward to hearing more about your journey and to hear more about your research. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you, Simon Stebbings, to deliver your inaugural professorial lecture. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, mihi mō te haere mai. Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming along tonight, and it's great to see some familiar faces out there. I'm going to talk a little about my career, and when I talked to a friend about what I was going to talk about tonight, he said, so you have 45 minutes to talk about your whole career, and I nodded. And he said, so how will you fill the last half hour? But I'll try my best. And I'll start off just by talking a little bit about the title of my talk. So I hope nobody's come along expecting a talk about lunar exploration, but the title comes from Shakespeare. And in Midsummer Night's Dream, the quote is, therefore the moon, the governess of floods, pale in her anger, washes all the air that rheumatic diseases do abound. And Shakespeare knew that rheumatic diseases did indeed abound, and I know that from my clinical and research work. And you might think it's a little pretentious starting off with Shakespeare, but I'll explain why Shakespeare is important to me as we go through. Good. So I always like to let people know what they're going to expect with a talk so that they can work out how much longer there is to go. I'm going to start with a little bit of philosophy and then my journey into medicine, my journey through medicine as a doctor, then my journey into research, a little bit about teaching, and then finishing up with a bit more philosophy. So usually when it comes to a career, I think we all like to think about our careers perhaps following this trajectory here. We've got distance travelled in our career over time, and it's a nice linear journey. But my journey was a bit more like this ECG tracing here. It's a bit more up and down, I think, as you'll see. So I promised to start with a bit of philosophy, and Jean-Paul Sartre, who was an existentialist, had this to say. He said, each choice we make in life defines us while at the same time revealing to us what we think it is to be human. So the choices that we make define us in life, and I suppose that defines my career and also some of my passions. So outside medicine and research, my passions, I suppose, are literature and music. particularly in terms of music, what Apple iTunes might unfortunately term alternative stroke punk. So I've tried to frame Jean-Paul Sartre in ways that I understand, because I'm not very good at philosophy, and two people have helped me. One is the Talking Heads, one of my favorite bands, and they said, and you may ask yourself, how did I get here? And the answer to that comes from a book by one of my favorite authors, Kurt Vonnegut, who says, I was a victim of a series of accidents, as are we all. And the first accident that any of us have is our accident of birth. So this is my family here, and this is a holiday early on, as you can see. This is my mother and father. My mother was born in Skegness, and this is our holiday in Skegness here, which is a beautiful resort town on the north coast of Lincolnshire, between Cleethorpes and Mablethorpe. And my mother was born here, and then she became a radiographer later in life, and she was the rock of our family. And this is my father here. He was a general practitioner and one of the first people to start a health centre in England. And when I was growing up, I watched the health centre being developed and built, and I think that was a big influence on me wanting to become a doctor. As you can see, my sister is a bit older than me. She trained to be a teacher, and in the holidays I was her working job, really. So when I'd be asked to provide something on a page for the teacher about what we did in our holidays, most people produced like one page about what they did, but my sister would sit over me for the entire holiday and make sure that I did something every day, so I'd have a kind of War and Peace to present to the teacher at the end of it. So she was quite a hard taskmaster, really. And this is my favourite picture of me on a horse or a Shetland pony. I think it was sixpence to go all the way along the Skegness beach, and I have a look of grim determination on my face there, which I think stood me in good stead. And then I've missed out my brother here, Paul, and so he gets a slide to himself. So my brother Paul is artistic director of TNT Theatre, and I recently saw his production of Othello. He specialises in Shakespeare, produces Shakespeare all over the world, and this is his favourite picture of himself in front of Buckingham Palace holding his MBE for services to the theatre. And haven't we heard a lot about that? So that was my family, and I grew up in Nottingham. That's where I was born, and this is the school I went to, Nottingham High School. I took this picture when I was 18. I had a slightly ambivalent view of school at that time, as you can see from this picture. I think I've been listening to too much Joy Division, but when I look back, it was a very good school, and in particular I remember one teacher who was Mr. William Ruff, my English teacher, who really instilled in me a passion for literature. These were some of the books that he introduced me to, and he really wanted me to go to university and study literature, but I stuck to my guns. I wanted to do medicine. He couldn't really understand that, particularly as I was very, very bad at all the subjects that you needed to get into medical school. And unfortunately, at the end of my time at school, I did very well in English, but very badly in chemistry, biology, physics, and maths, and I didn't get into medical school. So I couldn't stay on at school, so my choices were limited, but fortunately there was somewhere that saved me, and that was the People's College of Further Education. And if you don't believe that really existed, there's the report card from there. So People's College was this sort of building here, a very 60s institution, and I had an interesting year there. So this was how I started out from school, and this is how I ended up at the end of the year. I think I developed some attitude. But needless to say, fortunately, I did get sufficient grades at the end of that year to be let into medical school, and a very obscure medical school in London accepted me, called the Middlesex Hospital Medical School. At this time, there was quite a major reorganisation happening in London medical schools. There started off being 12 of them, and by the end of my time in London there were only 4. And our school was amalgamated into University College London at the end of my second year. And the name of Middlesex Hospital was no more, and in fact this is where the Middlesex Hospital Medical School was. It's now a huge hole in the ground, so not only has the name gone, but all the buildings have been demolished as well. So I ended up in this much larger and some would say more prestigious medical school. That's me on the back row of our year photo, and this is University College Hospital there. I can't say I enjoyed my time at medical school very much at all, actually, and that was for a number of reasons. Firstly, we didn't have a curriculum, so I'd often ask, what are we supposed to learn? And they'd just say, well, you have to learn everything, which wasn't very helpful, really. And then the main way that we were taught was through a kind of ritual humiliation. So you'd go onto the ward, and then people who are much more experienced than you, consultants and senior registrars, would ask you questions that you didn't know the answer to, and then humiliate you in front of patients, nurses, student nurses, and their colleagues. So it was rather a miserable experience, I'd have to say, except for one bright spark of 3 months. And this was another People's. I had 3 months overseas as an elective in the People's Republic of China. And China was a very different place when I was there in 1987. And this was at the Sun Yat-sen University of Medical Sciences, where I studied infectious diseases for 3 months, with this gentleman here, Professor He. And Professor He was the only person that I remember in my whole of my medical school time who was respectful, kind, helpful, and taught me things. So I have a great memories of Professor He, and I think that he had humility and he had kindness, which were probably bred into him by having survived the Cultural Revolution, which was a very different experience from the people who taught me in London, who had a lot of hubris. So at the end of my time at medical school, I did manage to graduate just, and I wasn't a very good student, but I went from one day being a medical student to the next day being Dr. Stebbings' house officer. And this was a huge jump, really. It was like being told you can suddenly fly a plane when you'd never been off the ground. And I like this quote from Dickens, which is probably very familiar to many people. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, which it certainly was. But the quote goes on, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, it was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. And that really sums up about the first 3 years of my time as a doctor. But this was the contents of my pocket here. So we had to wear white coats at the time, and this book here really helped me to get through things. The Oxford Handbook of Clinical Medicine told me everything I needed to know. And I had a little notebook. This really is true. This is the actual thing I had in my pocket. And it said, "Don't panic," in large friendly letters. That says reminder here on the side. And every time I had to do a scary procedure, I'd look at this and it would help to calm me. That and an experienced nurse got me through many scrapes. But although it was a very challenging time, it was a very strangely enjoyable time. So this was the first hospital I worked at, St Andrew's Hospital, Bow in London. If you did well in your exams, you got to go to places like St Bartholomew's Hospital or the Royal Free Hospital. If you didn't do so well, you got sent to a very old Victorian workhouse which sprawled across the East End of London, most of which had empty rooms. But I had a fantastic team there, and at the end of 3 months I decided for certain that I wanted to be a hospital physician and doctor. That was despite working 100 hours a week on average and living in the hospital. So one of the great advantages of working such long hours was they gave you free accommodation in the Victorian workhouse, and this is where I lived up here in the attic, a vast room which had a tiny single bed, a telephone and a lamp so you could answer your pager. Of course, this is it being slightly demolished now, so like my medical school, it no longer exists, but it was a very important time for me. And after this, I got to work at a number of other old workhouses and TB hospitals around London, nothing very prestigious, unfortunately. And during that time, I had to study for my college exams to become a physician. And unfortunately, it took me 5 goes to get my membership of the Royal College of Physicians of London, which is this building here. And subsequently, when I came to New Zealand, they were very kind to let me into the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, and that's the garment I'm wearing today, the academic robes of the college, in memory of the difficult times I had in getting that exam. But then something changed for me which really was life-changing, and this happened in 1991. So you might recognize this man here. It's Freddie Mercury. And in November 1991, he released a press release, and it went like this: following enormous conjecture in the press, I wish to confirm that I have been tested positive for HIV and have AIDS. The time's now come for my friends and fans around the world to know the truth, and I hope everyone will join with me, my doctors, and all those worldwide in the fight against this terrible disease. And this was really struck a chord with me, because at the time there was so much stigma against people who had AIDS, not only in the press, they called it the gay plague, but amongst medical practitioners too. And I felt very strongly about this, that I wanted to do something to help. So to put this into context, we tend to forget about this, but since the beginning of the epidemic of HIV, nearly 80 million people have been infected with HIV, and of those, 36 million people have died from AIDS around the world. This is what was happening at the time in London. We can see here that when I decided to work on an HIV ward, this was really at the peak of the epidemic, with the peak number of deaths that were happening. And most people who contracted AIDS at that time were gay men, except in Edinburgh. If you've ever seen the movie or read the book of Trainspotting, you'll know that Edinburgh was the place where intravenous drug users mostly had AIDS, but in London it was mostly gay men. So I elected to work at one of the 2 AIDS units in London. There was one at my former medical school and one at St. Stephen's Clinic at the Westminster Hospital, which is where I worked. And this was really a very challenging time for me. I spent a year there. I watched a lot of patients come through, and most of them during that period died from AIDS. It was a very horrible death, and many of the patients were so horribly stigmatized that they didn't tell their friends or family about their disease or why they were in hospital. But many of them had a great sense of humor, and a gallows sense of humor, really, and many of them became very well known to me. But it was a very traumatic time. We had a lot of personal risk too, because we were doing a lot of invasive procedures, and we knew that if we stabbed ourselves with a needle at that time, then we ourselves would contract HIV, and as we thought at the time, everybody who had AIDS died. So it was a traumatic time. We didn't have any sort of counselling or support, but memories are short, really, and I was rather annoyed, to say the least, to read things in the newspaper recently to say that the COVID pandemic was the first pandemic in living memory. It's like all this never happened. Of course, medical advances mean that nobody dies from AIDS now. It's a chronic disease, which is fantastic, but it saddens me that we've already forgotten about this epidemic and what it did to people. So at the end of this time, I couldn't really settle back into general medicine, so I sold my house and car, and I went on a big journey overland. I went to some extremely isolated places before ending up, after about 9 months, in New Zealand. And I needed to get a job because I'd run out of money by that time. And fortunately, they offered me a job at Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Rotorua, which is the only dedicated rheumatology and rehabilitation hospital in New Zealand. And that was a fantastic year. I learnt a lot about auditing and evidence-based medicine there, about rehabilitation, and I developed a love for New Zealand as well. And at the end of the year, I'd got enough money to pay for my return trip home, and I was just about to go and buy that ticket when this gentleman here, who I think is in the audience, actually gave me a phone call out of the blue. I'd never met him in my life, but he phoned up and he said, "Hello, it's John Heighton here. I'm looking for somebody to help me with my research. Do you want to come down to Dunedin?" And since I hadn't got any other offers, I thought, well, this sounds like a reasonable thing. I won't go home after all. I'll try Dunedin. So I went down to Dunedin, and that's where I started to develop my interest through John in ankylosing spondylitis. So ankylosing spondylitis is a disease which affects the spine, and this is a famous photograph of a man over many years and what ankylosing spondylitis can do. It causes deformity and extreme pain and disability. It's a devastating disease. Unfortunately, with modern treatment, we can really prevent this from happening, which has been fantastic. That's happened in my practicing lifetime. This is a bone scan which just shows the degree of inflammation that can happen in the spine, throughout the spine and the sacroiliac joints, the extent of inflammation that people with this condition have. What we know about this, and have known since 1973, is that it's strongly genetically determined disease. So twin studies show that there's a strong concordance between identical twins, and as you fall off from the distance of relatedness from brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers, your risk falls significantly. So there's a strong genetic aspect, but that's not the whole story. There's something else that's going on as well. And what we have thought for a number of years is that's some kind of microbial trigger. And one of the reasons for that is reactive arthritis, which is also part of the same spectrum of disease as ankylosing spondylitis, is triggered by known organisms, which you might have heard of: Campylobacter, Salmonella, Shigella dysentery. So we know that some bacteria can trigger this type of arthritis. Furthermore, if we take rats that have been made transgenic for human B27 and they're brought up in germ-free conditions, they won't get arthritis. But if they are exposed to bacteria, they get this arthritis very like humans. So I was lucky. I got a travelling fellowship and did a master's degree with John and Gerald Tannock, who was an expert in the intestinal microbiome. This was some of my, I throw nothing away, as you can see. This is all my lab books from the time. And what we did was we looked for a year at the intestinal microbiome in patients with ankylosing spondylitis. So it might disturb you to think just how many bacteria there are in our gut. There are more bacteria in the gut than there are cells in the human body, and over 500 different species. And these tend to be quite stable during life. So what we wanted to find out was what was happening to these bacteria, if they were different in patients with ankylosing spondylitis to healthy people. And in order to do that, we needed to collect fecal samples. And this was not particularly popular with one of our staff here, which is Judith McPhail, our nurse, who's I think in the audience today. So Judith was used to dealing with people with arthritis, not with a large tsunami of fecal specimens arriving on her doorstep every day. But she was very stoical about that and very helpful. We used to culture some of these. This is a culture of sulfate bacteria from the stool. But we had quite a wonderful and at that time very up-to-the-minute technique called DGGE, where we got these beautiful readouts of all the different bacteria that were in a patient's fecal specimen. And as you can see, each person has a unique sort of fingerprint of their bacteria. So the bacteria tend to be stable over time and unique to that person. And although we didn't find any difference between the control group and our ankylosing spondylitis patients, it was the first time anybody had really looked at this in ankylosing spondylitis. And it took a very long time to get a journal to accept this, but ultimately it got cited a lot of times, and I ended up having to peer review about 10 years later, when this became a trendy topic, all the papers that had been recently written, because nobody else had ever published on this. So it was quite gratifying. And at the end of that time, I had to decide whether I was going to go back to England or not. So in the words of The Clash, should I stay or should I go? And in the end, I did a bit of both. I went back to England, and then I came back to New Zealand when I was appointed as a senior lecturer. And the university was very gracious. They gave me an early career researcher grant, and I did some more work with Gerald and John, and we looked at the immune response to autologous, that's the patient's own bacteria, both in patients with ankylosing spondylitis and controls. And in this study, which again was quite a gratifying one, we found that patients with ankylosing spondylitis didn't mount an anti-inflammatory response like healthy people did, which suggested that they'd lost tolerance to the bacteria in their gut. And we wondered if we could take that a bit further by making their gut bacteria healthier. So to do that, we did a study of probiotics. And this was with my colleague, Katie Jenks, who about 10 years after me did a master's project with me. And we looked at giving a probiotic to patients with ankylosing spondylitis with common bacteria that you'd find in yogurt, lactobacilli and bifidobacteria, to see if this would be a treatment for ankylosing spondylitis. And this is what we found. Week 4, they were neck and neck. Week 12, placebo group was a bit ahead. And at week 16, there was no difference. So unfortunately, probiotics were not the treatment of choice for ankylosing spondylitis, and all the shares I bought in probiotics were worthless. But after this, I decided that we needed to go a bit bigger. So I started up a group called the Spondyloarthritis Genetics and the Environment Study Group, and this was a group of the willing, really, around New Zealand. So fortunately, all the major centres, all my rheumatology colleagues decided to help out with this. And over a period of 5 years, we collected 300 patients with ankylosing spondylitis, and we were able to follow them yearly for 5 years, and we collected material for genetic analysis. So this was a big project, and it certainly wasn't just me. So this is a picture of some of our team, some of the rheumatologists around New Zealand. And particularly important were 2 people here. There was Deborah McNamara, who was our research nurse, who recruited patients and did their measurements. And this was Mary Wallace in the lab, who extracted all the genetic material and sent that off for analysis into our international collaborators. But we wanted to look at a few different things. We got a bit sick of collecting fecal samples. I think Judith drew the line there too. So we thought we'd have a look at dysbiosis. That means a disruption of the healthy microbiome in the mouth instead. So we were able to have a great collaboration with the dental school at this point. And we looked at periodontal disease. So if you ever go to the dentist and they whip out these instruments here, they're going to shove it up into your gum and measure to see if your gums are healthy. So we did that, and then we collected microbial material from those interdental pockets as well. We had some interesting results. We found that activity of disease in ankylosing spondylitis mirrored the amount of periodontal disease. So that had never been shown before. That was quite interesting. And we were able to send off the microbial material to collaborators in Canada who had the sort of next phase of microbial analysis. So you can go from culture to the DGGE that I did when I was doing my master's to this, which is the latest way of looking at it. So this is a heat map showing all the different bacteria in the pocket, and these are sort of diversity indexes showing whether different patients have a different diversity to their bacteria. And the answer to that was no. There was no difference again between controls and the patient group. But what it did show me was that this was an extremely expensive and difficult line of research to do. So I decided at that point to draw a line under microbial investigation. So we did some clinical studies. We validated this questionnaire here looking at bowel symptoms, and this was quite interesting. We wanted to see if patients had clinical symptoms of bowel disease, even though they had ankylosing spondylitis, because of this overlap between inflammatory bowel disease and ankylosing spondylitis and reactive arthritis. And we found that, in fact, indeed, patients with spondyloarthritis fell somewhere between patients with inflammatory bowel disease and healthy people, and that this was linked with disease activity too. So those were interesting things that we found. And we also, we didn't give up on stools completely. We just gave people this chart here to stick on their toilet door. You can try this at home. You can grade your stools on the Bristol stool chart and then send them in, as our patients did, for a week. And we found that our patients with ankylosing spondylitis had increased stool frequency and loose stools compared with the control group, but not as bad as people who'd had true gut inflammation with inflammatory bowel disease. And this kind of stayed pretty stable over the course of our study up to 60 months, really. So bowel symptoms hadn't previously been noted to be a problem in patients with ankylosing spondylitis, so this was quite gratifying to find. And then, of course, we collected all the genetic material. So I've talked about HLA-B27, which is the strongest risk factor for ankylosing spondylitis, and it was for a time thought that this was the single gene that was involved, but we now know that there are over 150 additional risk genes which can contribute to ankylosing spondylitis. And I was very lucky to collaborate with an international group which was very high profile, submitting our patients' genetic material and clinical data, and we were able to work out multiple risk variants within the genome for ankylosing spondylitis, and ultimately, most recently, to develop a risk score which might be a way of identifying patients who have ankylosing spondylitis from their genetic profiling. And then we kind of formulated a theory about dysbiosis and homeostasis and gut inflammation and genetics, and we published that recently, which was an interesting project to do, to try and put everything together after a number of years of research. So that's a little clue into my research background. I just wanted to finish off with a few things about teaching, because sometimes that seems to be put to the side a little bit in the university, and it's such a core part of what we do and a core interest of mine. So I think it is a big responsibility. The Medical Council says that medical students are tomorrow's doctors, which is very true. And what we have to do is to make sure that they know that the care of the patients is their first concern, that they act in a professional and ethical manner, and that they take responsibility for their actions in often complex and uncertain situations. So it would be nice if our students were better prepared than I was when I became a house surgeon. So with that in mind, I really enjoy teaching, trying to prepare our students. From my own experience, I found that ritual humiliation was not an effective teaching tool, so I've put that to one side now. But I do like to tell students what they need to learn, and my experience was that we had to learn everything. But you don't have to learn everything, you just have to learn what's important. And if you tell the students what they should learn, what's really important, then they'll learn it. It's not a secret. And learning can be fun. Here are some students that I didn't prepare earlier. They look like they're having fun, they're smiling. And if they see patients, real patients, and they can follow a patient journey or hear of a patient's experience, they often really learn around that because they remember the patient and that experience. It's very powerful for them. So clinical teaching is really essential. We've combined a bit of teaching and research. So That's kind of the best thing to do, really, if you can research into teaching. So we set up an online blended learning approach. So we put a lot of learning materials on Moodle, and we've streamed that across the 3 schools. So we have the same curriculum that we teach in each school with the same resources, and students really love this. It helps to improve their knowledge around things so that they can bring that to our tutorials and to the patients. And we published on this a few years back now, which was good. And finally, I guess I've talked about undergraduates, but I should talk about my postgraduate students. So I've been extremely lucky to be a co-supervisor for a number of PhD students, and to have a wonderful mentor who told me how to be a supervisor. That was Professor David Baxter, who I really thank for helping to set me on that path. And I've had some great students. Leslie Ward, who was my first PhD, she got an exceptional thesis looking at yoga practice in chronic pain for rheumatoid arthritis. And then I've got a long-standing collaboration with the psychology department. Roisin Hegarty looked at psychological flexibility in managing fatigue-related disability. Carrie Falling, who looked at musculoskeletal chronic pain and inflammatory bowel disease, and Miranda Buller, who spent 8 years part-time looking at the base of thumb osteoarthritis here. So I've learned a huge amount of that. I probably know more about this joint than any other rheumatologist in New Zealand, thanks to Miranda. And it's been a great sort of helping with their journeys and learning so much from their journey through research. And that sort of leads me to finishing off, really, because research is the backbone of medicine, and if we don't do research, we're stuck in a rut. We can never move forward. And we might end up making statements like this. So this was a Surgeon General, William Stewart, in 1968, who unfortunately said, "The time has come to close the book on infectious diseases. We've basically wiped out infection in the United States." So even in 1968, that was perhaps a bold statement. But this is me in my second global pandemic, COVID-19, when I was redirected to doing general medicine for a short time when we were in the first lockdown. So that was an interesting experience too. So I'd like to finish off by thanking a few people. I'd like to thank particularly my 2 children, Mo and Theo. Theo is in the audience today, who helped me with some of the philosophy. Thank you, Theo. And of course, my colleagues in the rheumatology department here, Katie Jenks, Sarah Jordan, and Joe Mitchell, with John Heighton in the middle here. And they say it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it certainly takes a rheumatology department to keep in line an errant academic in their midst. So thank you for that. And I like to come full circle, so I'll finish with Jean-Paul Sartre again. And a thought for you, which is, as a medical student, you start by knowing nothing about anything, and that's certainly very true. Then as you become a doctor, you learn more and more about less and less as you become a specialist, until you reach a professor, and by that time you know everything there is to know about nothing. And this was shown by Jean-Paul Sartre, who obviously got to the end there and wrote a whole book about nothingness. So I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou katoa. My name is Rachel Taylor, for those of you who don't know me. It's my very great pleasure to say thank you to Simon for an amazing half an hour or so whistle-stop tour through his life, from his early pony days through to a medical student, clinician, researcher and teacher. I think he did, I'm sure you'll agree with me, a fascinating summary with highs and lows, with humour and humility, and a whole variety of things like that. One of the wonderful things I think about IPL, Simon, is that you get to know a bit more about people that you often didn't know beforehand. And I think that was really signified here by your use of Shakespeare in your title. And then in the next breath, we're talking about Joy Division and Talking Heads and so on. And I think it's a really lovely aspect of the IPL. I think it was fascinating to see your career through the medical system, and in particular some of the things like the experience of working on the AIDS ward, which must have been amazing. I'm not sure how many people saw a recent series that was on TV1, but exactly like that, called Sin or something like that, and you really brought home that situation. I really liked also how you mentioned teaching, because as you know, I talked to you about teaching a couple of weeks ago, and I was intrigued with, because I sent Simon a special, well done, because he got some of the best reviews I've ever seen in his teaching, not in his teaching, in any teaching recently, with quite a few students who said, what an amazing guy, what an amazing teacher. But I was particularly intrigued at the comment there about the secrets, that you don't keep it a secret, because one of the comments was, oh my God, this was revolutionary. He told us what we needed to know. And so I think that summed it up beautifully in terms of amazing researcher, amazing teacher, and obviously a very interesting, eclectic range of interests in man. So on behalf of the university, it's difficult, you've run out of hands here, Simon, but well done.
Oh, thank you very much.